strange-shaped head because this thing never fits on me. Good, we're up there. And am I mic'd? Yes. Okay. And it keeps falling off. So, both last night and this morning, as I looked in the mirror and was reminded two things. Who's this strange guy staring at me? And secondly, that I've got a whole lot more hair than I've ever had before in my entire life. And I was trying to decide whether or not to have the Luke look, with my hair sticking out all over. I thought, well, it doesn't look nearly as good on me as it does on him. Or whether or not I ought to have the Hans look and start my ponytail.
The Hans look.
So we're stuck with the Fred look, which is not nearly as good looking as either one of them. How does Jesus change us? Nearly everybody here hasn't seen much of us in the last 6 months, and that's been largely due. We've attended a couple times, but it's been largely due to our concern about the the COVID-19, and we've missed being here, but we have seen every service on YouTube. So we participated. We've done our own communion with you. And each one of us has our own idea about what's safe and what isn't safe. But since both of us have some pre-existing conditions that supposedly make us more vulnerable than others, we've just decided to stay home. So that's just for your information. That's number one. But number two, and I'm just going to mention this too. Looking at the Kansas Department of Health statistics, I don't know if anybody else looks at that, but I do. So far, we've had nearly 28,000 diagnosed cases. 63% of those have been people under 45. Of those 63% of all those cases, your chances of actually dying once you've got it is less than 1 in 1,000. No big deal. Most of those people have been sick anyway, so no big deal. If you happen to be over 75, like we are, your chances of dying are 1 in 6.5 once you've contracted COVID. That's Kansas Department of Health statistics. So with that in mind, we have a second consideration other than just our own. As some of you know, Bonnie and I deliver Meals on Wheels. And we've become very fond of our clients. They've become friends. They know that we pray for them, for instance. And just to give you a rough idea, our first stop is with Marcy, who's 97, probably weighs 80 pounds, wears a neck brace, and we think is very vulnerable, as all of them are. Boy, I'm having trouble, aren't I? And then it's Stan, who a year ago had back surgery and has never recovered from that. He can be on his feet to get to the door in order to pick up the meal. As far as I know, there's nobody else in town that he knows other than the people who deliver Meals on Wheels. Deanne lost her husband at Meadowlark, not because of COVID, but was over there during the pandemic and really never got to say goodbye. Jane, who is new to us, she's recently, she doesn't come to the door. We ring the bell, leave it on the porch, and sometimes she shouts to us from the door, "Thank you." Missy and Mike has onset of dementia. She's very concerned about his well-being, and they keep their distance, believe me. And we leave theirs on the table outside the door, but they oftentimes come out and, again, talk to us from a distance. And then there's Clara, who's diabetic, desperately trying to diet, and had heart surgery 3 weeks ago. But she's back home, or back in her apartment, rehabbing. We feel like these people are all very vulnerable. And for that reason, we try not to be exposed to anybody else if we can help it. And so that's our reasoning. And you say, well, why had Fred made a big deal out of this? I'll tell you later. It's going to come up as part of how does Jesus change us? Now, if I've got this right. So back to the subject. You know, when I first saw how does Jesus change us, I was thinking that it was supposed to be some kind of personal thing, even kind of like a testimonial. So I began, and yet people have gone before me, haven't really done that sort of thing, been more sort of an academic, what does the Bible say about Jesus? But I thought, how has Jesus changed me? And so even a couple months ago, I started thinking about that. And because I thought this was the intent. And so that's how I'm going to present my remarks today. How has Jesus changed me as a person? We're all different. We all progress in our Christianity differently. We all came from a different starting point in terms of the sort of trek that we've made. I think in many ways mine hasn't been very remarkable. And in some other ways maybe it has. But again, I was here 2 weeks ago when Luke spoke, and Luke said something that really, really got me. So, how has Jesus changed me? Luke, and this, forgive me if I've misquoted you exactly, but he said something like this: we consider keeping the rules more important than why we do what we should be doing. And then he said, we focus on the law rather than the spirit of the law. Now, ask yourself that question. How much do I focus on the law rather than the spirit of the law? Well, okay, so I'm going to give you a little background about myself so you'll know where my trek began. When I was a child, most people in this country, in this part of the country, I grew up in Wichita, considered themselves Christians and were churchgoers. We were not churchgoers in our house. My mother had a church background, Methodist, I think, but we weren't churchgoers. But, and get this, because you college kids can't relate to this, a lot of you younger folks can't relate to this, but once a week from my grade school, each class walked 2 blocks down to the Methodist church where we got a Bible lesson and sang hymns. How far would that go today? So, that's what we did. And by the way, Gene didn't know it, but he walked right into it. Ferris Lord Jesus was one of the songs that I remember from that experience. And but amazingly, another thing about that was there was only one kid in the class whose parents wouldn't let him go. Today there'd be lots of folks who'd say, no, I don't want my child being a part of that. I'm afraid. So I was exposed to the idea of church and God, and I wanted to keep the rules. And I did a lot of trying to keep the rules as I grew up because I was afraid that God was up there with his eye on me, just waiting for me to screw up. So that I turned out to be basically a good kid. Okay? I don't have any of those things to talk about that says I was here and I came out of that miserable person and became, I had none of the vices, as I kept growing older, no drinking, no smoking, no carousing, other than the same little bit of experimental stuff that kids do, but in general, no. So who did Jesus criticize most? Let's go. We often, as Luke said, we often focus on the law rather than the spirit of the law. Who did he criticize most? Scribes and Pharisees, the law keepers, the people who said, if you carry, how heavy a stick can you carry 100 yards on the Sabbath, kind of thing. Those are the people he criticized the most, the hypocrites. Matthew 23:23, we were reminded when he's responding to some of the Pharisees, you give a tenth of everything you have, even down to your spices and herbs. But you neglect justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And the same setting in Luke includes you fail in terms of your love for God. As I look back, I think even though I was working hard to be a good rule keeper, I believe God was already molding me long before I realized what Jesus' role was. We all know the expression, I see Jesus in him, I see Jesus in her. I think I could see Jesus in my mother. I don't know that I knew that at the time. But in preparing this lesson, I also looked at the fruit of the Spirit. I think she was dead on every single one. She was the most loving person. She was my good example. My dad was a good man. He was honest. He provided well for his family. He also drank too much, smoked too much, never exercised, weighed too much, and yelled too much. He was kind of my example of what not to be growing up. Other than the fact that I say he was a good man. Is that an oxymoron? I'm not sure. But I learned from both of them. And as I said, I've always been pretty good at keeping the rules, but maybe not behaving as Jesus taught us to behave. So in preparation for this morning, I got out our red letter Bible, or at least one of them. I know we've got at least one. To see what Jesus said. And you all know that everything in those Bibles, everything that Jesus said is highlighted in red. Okay? To see what our behavior should be. And I came up with a list. Are you ready for me to talk about all these? That was a joke. I won't talk about all of these. But this is kind of the short list, because this was what I saw as things that Jesus spoke to that had to do with our behavior, with a couple of exceptions, which I'll point out in a minute, rather than some kind of rule that we ought to keep. Now, if you're frantically starting to write them down, Bonnie has a few copies. I left a couple copies on a chair back here of this list, number one. Number two, this is basically going to be the only slide from now on. So, so don't worry about writing those things down. If you'd like to have a list, there's going to be one here somewhere. What I didn't mention a little earlier was that my mother finally got the family mobilized so that we started attending a Presbyterian church, sometime in junior high. So we became church goers. And since I'd been, as I was told, sprinkled as a baby, and because I was a good guy, I figured I was pretty well doing what needed to be done to be a Christian. Then I met my wife, and see where I am here. And began to understand that there are two things on this list that are not negotiable. They're not just about behavior. And the first one, is highlighted. No one comes to the Father except through me. That's what Jesus had to say. And John was pretty clear about it. Now, this pretty young thing that I was pretty interested in wound up becoming my wife. I didn't make her one promise. I'm not sure I promised anything else other than to love and obey, and I try to obey. I do love. But I made one promise, and that was that I would always attend church with her. And I'm sure she would support that if you ask her. But in that, because I said that, of course, I became well acquainted with her father and her mother, a woman named Nellie Jacobs, who I think God must have put us in a place to live, which meant she was right on her way to church and had no transportation. So we picked her up every day coming to church. And did she ever witness to me? Never said a thing directly, but indirectly. One of my heroes. And there are a few of you here who know her. Not very many probably anymore, but a few do. And I think I saw Jesus in all of these people. And I began to think that maybe this Jesus guy was somebody pretty important. But I didn't do much about that. And time went on, and about 5 years later, we found ourselves in San Antonio, 2 little girls. We were looking for, the second one was still shared Bonnie's body, but when we got to San Antonio, she was very anxious for us to find the right church where I would be impressed enough that I would finally say, look, I need to be baptized. And so there was a man who, again, some of you will know the name, Roy Osborne, who was a well-known back then preacher way on the other side of town. And of course, San Antonio is huge. So we visited over there. We visited some other churches near us. And Roy Osborne was a terrific preacher, but when we pulled in the parking lot, all I saw were Cadillacs and Porsches. And so when we got home, I said, I don't want to go there. And she says, oh, please, I think that's where we ought to go. I said, no, I don't want to go. Let's go to the one closest to us, which now has more notoriety than that one because it's the Oak Hills Church of Christ in San Antonio. And so we did. And while we were there, we got involved with a home Bible study. Bonnie always nudging, always pulling, always leading, and me always saying, I feel responsible to go with her. And at that point in time, I was beginning to hear a lot more about this thing, baptism. And so, again, in John, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. One must be baptized. And so I sort of put that in the back of my mind. But one evening after the Bible study was over, and as typical, the ladies went somewhere else in the house, and the men were all sitting around. A guy named Gene Soloway said, Fred, why haven't you been baptized? Wow. So I didn't have an answer at the time, and I tried to dismiss it, but I couldn't. And as I recall, that was a Thursday. Well, he and I had already agreed that on Saturday we were going to go down and pick up a side of beef that we were going to share. So Saturday, Bonnie can probably correct me because she probably remembers these details better than I do, but Bonnie, I think it was Saturday morning, I said to Jean, if you have time, maybe on the way home we could go by the church building. You can baptize me. I don't know whether Jean's feet hit the floor before he said, Bonnie, get on the phone. Because I remember that was our house. And so she was busy telling all of our friends to meet us at the church building while he and I were picking up this side of beef, which became pretty incidental to the whole thing. And so that's where my new birth began in 1972, I think. And I've always thought probably isn't really important for me to remember the day. It just is to remember that it happened. Okay. So I'm not going to talk about a lot of these things, but I am going to talk about a couple, because I did say, how has Jesus changed me? And my wife looks like she's signaling me to talk louder. Okay. The first thing that got me about changing myself, and remember, I was pretty straight arrow, and I was pretty boring as a kid. But I had some flaws, obviously. We all do. And so the first thing, I think it's going to be on here, is I got to thinking, boy, I've got to be sure that I don't cause somebody else to stumble, that I don't cause somebody else to sin. And so I've taken that seriously for my entire life since then. And I think I could say that's the first thing that Jesus spoke directly to in terms of you need to be like this, not like that I did. But I took it very seriously. That was the easy, maybe not the easiest one, but it was the first quick fix, I guess. There were places that I knew I wouldn't go again. There were places I knew, things I wouldn't say again. There were actions that I might not take again, whatever they were. Secondly, though, had to do with money. And, we had always tithed. That was, I'm not sure I promised it to Bonnie when we got married, but we always tithed. We always contributed. And so I thought, that's great. We're good. What else is there? There are not a whole lot of things Bonnie nags me about. But every time something comes up where we say, this would be something good to contribute to, this would be a Christian work, or this would just be a good thing, I say, we already make our contribution. Why should we give more? She would say, because it's the right thing to do. And so that's been a real struggle for me. Mine is mine, for goodness sakes. I worked hard to get it. It's been a work in progress, but I think I've gotten there pretty much. I no longer try to hang on to, postpone writing a check. If I think, and I agree, and we've agreed together that it's something that we should do. I think that's one of the ways that God has changed me. And as Jesus said in Luke, he said first in Mark, here's a woman who has almost nothing, and she gives half, all of what she has. I'm going along. I'll try to hold off on some of the stories. But my treasure was not in giving as much as it was keeping the law. And I had to get over that. I think I've come part way. Another thing which, the person you're married to knows you, right? Better than yourself, probably, a lot of times. Another thing that's been an issue with me is being critical. Sometimes judging people's motives and what they do. And I've really had to try to work on that. But Jesus says, and I've got the story of the woman at the well, or the woman caught in sin, in John. And Jesus says, the one of you without sin be the first one to take action. And so they all walked away because what did they know? They all knew that they were sinners also. He says in Matthew, do not judge that you would be judged likewise. And the more I thought about these things, the more I thought I need to get over being such a critical guy. Oftentimes, people might not have known it, but that was the way it was. Okay. Finally, the last 2 points in a summary. Jesus said there are 2 things more important than all the rest. And it's something that I've really dwelled on a lot lately. I even preached a sermon on it, but maybe it was the last time I spoke. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, with all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then he said, if you do these 2, everything else will follow. And then the real kicker was, who is my neighbor? Well, I think it's easier to love God than it is your neighbor a lot of times. And there are a lot of unlovable people, right? Well, at least from our perspective, there may be. There are people who smell differently than I do, that talk differently, that dress differently, that look differently, act differently, and are politically different than I am. I'm supposed to love all those folks. I'm supposed to even reach out to them as the Good Samaritan did, even whether I like it or not. And I'm able to do some of that. I'm not sure I've done all of that yet. And finally, and it's something that kind of Tyler's remarks this morning when he first started talking about giving that kind of set this up. And this is back to our Meals on Wheels, folks. I don't know whether or not the people we take Meals on Wheels to are among the least of these. I do know that for several of them we may be, and some of the other people that sometimes deliver to on our route too, we may be the only people they see all week. Some of them I know are lonely. And they may or may not be among the least of these, but we really feel responsible to them. And there was a time when somebody would say, let's go do a good thing. Let's go help here. Let's volunteer for that. And I would say, I want to work in my garden today, or I want to go jog. I don't want to do that. And now I say, I need to do this, and I may have to give up the other. And I'm willing to do that. And I think that's one of the ways, and an important way, that Jesus has changed me. Well, there are several things I know. Do I fall short? Often. There are lots of scriptures I didn't talk about, some of them because I avoided them. I know that I'm far from perfect, but I also know that God's forgiveness still gives me the assurance that I have a home in heaven. And that's important. So I would ask, how has Jesus changed you? And what still needs the most work? If anyone here needs to be baptized, if anyone has other needs that the church can meet, you're certainly encouraged to come up here. Gene or other elders will be here to greet you